You may be familiar with the command in James chapter 4, verse 7 that says, "Resist the devil and he will flee from you." There's also another couple of places in the New Testament that say similar things, like 1 Peter 5, verse 9 says that we're to stand firm against the devil and be strong in our faith. And also Ephesians 4, verse 27 tells us not to give a foothold to the devil. Over the years, I've heard people quoting these verses, usually when they're going through difficult circumstances, or they feel like they're under attack, or maybe they feel like they're facing temptation to sin, and they would say, "No, I need to resist the devil so that he'll flee from me." And then what happens is they may spend some time, usually loudly, out loud, rebuking the devil. And there's not really anything wrong with that. Our enemy deserves a good rebuking. In fact, in Colossians chapter 2, Paul says that Jesus has disarmed our spiritual enemies and publicly humiliated them through his victory on the cross. And the picture that Paul is painting here is similar to the Roman custom of the victory parade. And what would happen is when the Romans were victorious in battle, their general would dress up as Jupiter, who was their chief god, and would lead all of their enemies in this victory march. And they would strip them of all of their possessions and just publicly humiliate them in front of everybody as the ones who have been defeated. And Paul says this is what Jesus has done to the devil through his death and resurrection. However, one thing I've observed when people get into kind of rebuking the devil is that they spend a lot of time talking to the enemy rather than focusing on the victorious life that has been won for us by Jesus. And I suspect it's because we've taken these scriptures as sound bites and not really looked at what the biblical writers were getting at. But if we do take a closer look at the scriptures we mentioned in James and in 1 Peter and in Ephesians, what we'll find is that they actually teach us to resist the devil by submitting to God and living in peaceful relationship with each other. That's right. The enemy's most effective attack against us is in our relationships. The gift of peace that God gives us is most prominently expressed through relationship. Peace in our relationship with God. Peace in our relationship with each other. And it's this relational peace that we are told to strive for as the main way of resisting the devil's influence in our lives. James 3 talks about the pure wisdom that comes from God, and it's characterized by peace, by gentleness, mercy, preferring others, by good deeds and humility. It's sincere and it shows no favoritism. And James contrasts this with a worldly wisdom that he says is unspiritual and demonic. And that worldly wisdom is characterized by bitterness, by jealousy, and by selfish ambition. It covers up the truth through boasting and lying, and it leads to disorder and evil. And then in chapter 4, James points out the quarreling and fighting that's happening in the church. And he says it's because they're following the wisdom of the world that leads to strife instead of the wisdom of God that leads to peace. It's causing them to mistreat each other and act out of selfishness instead of humility. In verse 6, he reminds us that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Then he says we are to humble ourselves before God and resist the devil. In doing so, we'll reject the world's way of treating others and we'll walk humbly in God's way. And the way this is worked out in verses 11 to 12 of James 4, James says we're not to speak evil of each other by criticizing and judging. You see, it's all relational. Right relationship with God leads to right relationship with others and ultimately to resisting the devil. So to resist the devil so that he'll flee from you actually means to live in peaceful relationship with other people. In 1 Peter 5, Peter talks about the way that leaders are to care selflessly for the church, not out of their own selfish ambition, but for the good of the church family. And then he says the church family are to accept the authority of the leaders as they care for them. And then he says we're to clothe ourselves in humility as, he says, you relate to each other. Because God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. There's that phrase again. Choose humility before God, not selfish pride. And in doing so, we stand firm against the enemy. And this is the passage where Peter describes the devil as a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. And if you've seen any nature documentaries, you'll know that lions look for the stragglers in the herd, the animals who get separated or who get distracted and lag behind. When Christians don't engage in relationship with each other, or they isolate themselves, they become easy prey for the devil. Maintaining a relationship with others in the church is important. So again, in 1 Peter 5, we find that this kind of standing firm against the devil is actually about having relationship with each other. In Ephesians 4, Paul says that we're to be patient with each other, forgiving each other's faults in love for one another. And we're to strive for unity and peace. And later in the chapter, Paul contrasts the way of the unspiritual Gentiles, and they focus on selfishness, and he contrasts that with the renewed mind and nature that comes through following Jesus. And then he gets practical. He says, stop telling lies, stop being angry, stop stealing, stop using foul language. We're to get rid of bitterness and rage and anger and harsh words and slander and all evil behavior. These are the footholds of the devil. Instead, Paul says, we resist the devil by being kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving each other as God forgave us through Christ. So yet again, this idea of standing up to the devil, of not giving the devil a foothold, actually works itself out in relationship with each other. And if you think about it, this makes sense. See, God defeated the devil by removing our sin and restoring us to relationship with himself and relationship with each other. Jesus humbled himself upon the cross, serving us and taking our judgment upon himself. He didn't come to condemn us, but to save us. And if we're followers of Jesus, we'll find those same attributes reflected in our own lives and in our own relationships. Resisting the devil then is not about finding a demon under every stone or speaking harshly and loudly to the enemy of our soul. Instead, the focus is on humbling ourselves before God, getting our hearts right, submitting to God's ways and his wisdom, and clearing our relationships of bitterness, strife, and untruth. We love and forgive each other. We have patience with each other. We think the best of each other. And in doing so, we hand a black eye to the enemy of our souls who wants to sow division, unrest, and strife. Resistance to the enemy is relational. So let's love one another. And as we live as people of the peace of God, the people that God has made us to be, we give a good kicking to the devil while we're at it.